So, hi, George. Thanks for coming along this morning. Um, I'd just like to start by asking you, how did it begin with News International for you?
Well, newspapers were going this was in the early 2000s, and newspapers were still at the peak almost of communications, I guess. And Rupert Murdoch had decided that he was gonna invest $1 billion US in building 3 brand new printing facilities, state of the art. And so that with that money, they wanted also to do something different. And so that's where they asked me to come along and help them with their team. And what they wanted to create, I guess, was a different culture in a sense, but they also wanted to, by investing that $1 billion US, they also wanted to get their money back. So there was a different business model, and the model was something like 80% of employees were gonna be business contractors, and only 20% were gonna be full-time News International employees. And so a big difference there. So it meant working with a lot of business partners, as we called them, and getting them to do the work that were traditionally done by News International employees.
Right, right. So, I'm interested in the cultural dimension here. So, could you say a bit more then about what the culture was like at the time and where you were aiming to take the culture and why?
Newspapers traditionally had a lot of money. You know, they were the main means of communication globally, and organizations like News Corporation were massive politically and getting their message across. But that also filtered right down into every level of management and leadership. And the culture was very much command and control. And people had fear for their jobs. They were getting paid an awful lot of money, but if you screwed up on the night, you could lose your job. So it was very much, as I say, command and control, very fear driven. For those people that did have ideas, if they were in any way to go wrong, there would be a blame. So there was a lot of blame as well. So command and control with a lot of blame culture going on. And that was the culture. What did they want to get out of that? I guess by investing this $1 billion US at a time when newspapers were at their peak and predictions were that technology was going to take over, they wanted to do it with less News International employees. So it meant changing the mindset and and and, and getting people to be more autonomous. And that's a big stretch because the management and leadership teams were all very much command and control. So it meant they had to give up that power to the employees. And that was going to be a big shift. And that was part of the shift where they asked me to come in and help them with that.
Right. And so, what methods or models or principles were you using then to get things started?
My initial remit was to create stability as a group engineer. So my title was Group Engineering and Continuous Improvement Manager, but you can't really do continuous improvement until you get stability. And so my initial remit was to create stability in brand new factories with other engineers. So I wasn't doing this on my own. Of course, I was a big team. But from a group perspective, I reported to the managing director. And what we were trying to do is get stability through this brand new equipment, then we would focus on everything else. But it's making sure we were building that sort of autonomy in at the right levels at the beginning. Part of my remit, of course, was to create that stability. But once we had the stability, I had another remit. Well, I had two or three remits. The next one was to introduce ISO 9001. So I did that through 3 sites. And then following up with that, I did the environmental ISO, and then I did the health and safety. So for each one of these standards we were putting in place, I was now starting to standardize the workplace. And through that standardization, I was involving and engaging a lot more employees into developing those standards, where in the past, that would have just been done with the managers and leaders.
So, I think we're at the point in the journey where you're about to start the CI deployment or phase. So, could you tell us about how that got started and what was the intent there?
I developed a program where it really just expanded on what we did with the ISO standards, and that was creating teams. So for every ISO process that we had, from goods receiving to goods out or material out, we created teams. So I had something like 13 cross-functional teams at every site in that effort to try and engage. every individual. So we had 13 people over and above the teams that we'd created for the ISO standards. So we ended up having something like 20 odd teams at each site. So if you think of the ISO standards, like we had an environmental team. So one of in fact, it was our London site that won the UK Environmental Award. All the great work that they did, and that was a team, and it was all based on continuous improvement. So a big difference here was it was looking at the whole system and not just parts of it. So you go to many organizations today and they'll say, yeah, we don't include health and safety in our continuous improvement. Why not? So we had a health and safety improvement team. Everything they did was to improve the safety and well-being of every individual. Why wouldn't that be part of your business improvement system? Oh, we don't include them. Well, we included that. I included everything I possibly could and tallied up all those great things that people were doing, whether it be in the environment, health and safety, whether it be in quality or process control for the ISO standards. But then we had, like I said, 13 other teams that were integrated teams just looking at how do we remove waste? How do we improve effectiveness? How do we create better flow?
And what were you starting to see in the culture now at this point that was really different from where you'd started from?
Engagement. Without a doubt, engagement. Part of that learning for me after doing the first Shingle workshop is, what do we do now? So engagement and autonomy, hand in hand. And I think, I'll give you one example. I came back from the very first Discover workshop, and I took a site manager with me, the site manufacturing manager. And on the way back, we were driving back from I won't mention the organization that it was. And I thought, oh God, we're not doing anything like that. Have we done it all wrong? And then I thought, I said, no, let's just keep doing, but let's expand on the amount of people that we have. And I said, let's create a task, like a team, a task force. And we created the task force, and it was called the Shingle Task Force, by the way. It's like a Shingle steering team. But I wanted it because the organization, as I mentioned earlier, was made up of 80% of business partners, contract workers, and 20% of News International employees. I wanted this steering team to be made up of the same levels, and I didn't want any managers involved in it. So I excluded myself and the site director, who would normally be there chairing it, and in some way, not knowing, maybe even steering it in certain directions. It was one of the best things we ever did. Yeah, they came up with so many fantastic ideas. They really did, and some of them that would probably change my view on a lot of the human resources sort of practices that we had. So we had, like every organization, had performance improvement reviews. Everybody had a PDR. They introduced something called a PAL. A PAL was a personal achievement log.
Okay.
And it was their own responsibility to write in there what their achievements towards continuous improvement were and how they were developing themselves and being developed and how they were developing and improving the business.
And I'm sensing those days of fear, the command and control environment you described in the early days, those are starting to become a distant memory at this stage, right? Because people are volunteering to share and talk openly about their development needs, their objectives, their challenges, and their contributions. Those are very different conversations to the previous regime, right?
Yeah, and I think it does. It takes years. So I think with the Shingle model, what I realized as well, they were looking for 3 to 5 years minimum of your journey of continuous improvement on all your results. And it takes that long. It really does. I never thought about it before. It's one of the things I have in my head. If anybody ever asked me how long it would take, I'd usually say, no, I'm not your person. Because I have no idea, because everybody's different. And we're all going to take different times to get there. Building trust is probably the hardest thing in any organization. So you're changing your culture from one culture to hopefully a better one. So if it's a sort of command and control or a fear or a blame culture, or, there's lots of terminologies coming out these days with it, whether it's poison or whatever it is, these types of cultures going into this sort of coaching, developing, learning culture, that's all about trust. And trust takes time. Because it's about you doing what you say you're going to do. And if you say you're going to give people more empowerment, more engagement, more opportunities, then that takes time for everybody to find what their level is and to accept that level. And so I think about 3 years for us into that journey, we started to see a lot of that.
George, you're now on this journey path and your vision is clear. Tell us about some of the major results and accomplishments that this has led to.
Being recognized is really powerful. The Shingle one, especially for me, because it was about the people. And when Shingle came to site, they actually spent about 80% or more talking to the people on the shop floor, listening to them, reviewing their continuous improvement, coming to the manager to make sure that we were getting the results that people were saying they were, and taking that back to them and saying, well, here's what the manager is saying. Is that true from an employee perspective? So it was all about the employees. And that was a big difference that I found with the Shingle Prize. The steering team made it different as well. As I said, we created the steering team. They weren't really interested in winning the prize until we got there. And then I realized that when you give people that opportunity to be in something that they could achieve, they go for it. And winning breeds winning. Success breeds success. So it's no surprise that on our journey to being the Shingle Prize recipients, we became Lean Manufacturer of the Year, Environmental Company of the Year. We won the Printer Awards 5 years running. It's like the top football teams. Winning becomes a way of being. People want it. They want to go to these events. And we were starting to change the way we celebrated. We were taking our employees with us.
So now, with the benefit of hindsight and the ability to look back on all of this experience, George, what would you say, if you're doing it all again, what would you say to anyone starting this journey or in the middle of this journey? What were the top things to really focus on, or lessons to be learned to make this kind of success happen?
I think the first thing is get the right people in the right places. That's a start. I know it sounds like a segue from Jim Collins' about Good to Great, but it really is about that. Think about your leadership team. This will not work if you've got the wrong people on the bus. And it will never work if you've got the wrong driver. Because you will never get to the place you want to get. You'll get to the place where that driver wants to take you. And I think that's the important part. So the very top of the organization, where it's the MD, the president, you've got to make sure that that person is 100% behind where you're going. The next thing for me is a really clear understanding about systems. The systems must have a purpose. The managers manage those systems, and that people work in those systems. And if the systems are wrong, they'll drive the wrong behaviors. Take a systemic look at your organization with a clear understanding of what the impacts of the system will do. And most people don't. And I'm saying most people. There are plenty of organizations out there that do and understand that. But we hear it every day from the government. Oh, the system's broken. This is broken. That's broken. I think the final one is engage as many people as you can. Ask for volunteers. One of the big things that sticks in my head, and a lot of this is not new. I mean, the Rogers diffusion curve is absolutely phenomenal research that he did back again in the 50s, I think 1954. Ask for volunteers and you will no doubtedly get something in the region of 16% of your workshop. I've been doing that for the last 20 years. Sometimes I'm shocked by how many volunteers. You will get your mates will come in because they'll want to volunteer because they don't want to miss out. So you'll get the good people, but you'll also get all the good people that you didn't even know existed in your business. So ask for volunteers. Don't just go with your usual go-to people. Get those volunteers, because that research for me has really played out well. People will volunteer. You will get those innovators and you'll get the early adopters right away. They'll come in and they will help you get the early adopters later on. And so they will help you with that, getting the late majority sort of thing in that diffusion curve. So I think if you get them right, make sure your leaders are right, work on the systems. So that's it for me.
George, it's been an absolute pleasure hearing your stories and benefiting from your experience. Many thanks.
Thank you. Cheers.